you everyone for coming to the East Bay Ops DevOps Meetup group. I'm the VP Engineering at Location Labs. This is our space, at least our newest space. We're technically up on the 6th and 5th floor. We just got this space, so as you guys have probably noticed, there's no Wi-Fi yet. We almost got it a couple weeks ago, so that'll be here for next time. A little bit about us. We are here in Emeryville. We have over 1.3 million paying customers, which is phenomenal and awesome, and we love it here. We have 3 major products. They're all mobile-centric, family safety, family security. We have a family locator product, a product we call Controls and Insights. We have a product for mobile device management. All of our products are shipped with mobile operators, mobile carriers. Sprint, T-Mobile, Verizon, AT&T, and Telefonica in Spain, and we're over 200 plus employees. So it's a great place. We welcome you all. Grateful you all came, and for the employees, you guys have heard me say this stuff a bunch of times. Thanks for turning out too. You guys all came to hear Henry speak a little bit about Ansible. Before I hand it over to Henry, I just wanted to say a couple words briefly to introduce him, for those that don't know him. Henry is a DevOps engineer with us. He is our most recent winner of the Spartan Shield Award, which is kind of our employee of the quarter, if you will. Somebody who goes above and beyond and supports their other teammates and really does awesome stuff for us. He's also been one of the main champions of Ansible and the migration to Ansible, along with a few others at Location Labs. And so he's going to give us a talk today about how we use Ansible and some of the little-known extensions. So, Henry.
You're going to have to bear with me a little bit as I become less nervous. Does this work? Excellent. Okay, so how many people here have used Ansible? Okay, good. I'm gonna be real quick-ish in the start, but still try and make sure that there's logic around it. It does these things. It's a deployment and orchestration tool. It aspires towards letting you describe the state of a system instead of writing bash scripts to maybe get to a state of a working system. The core is in Python. Most of the work you would do in Ansible is going to be in YAML. This is what YAML looks like. It's really great at lists. This would be a set of tasks that install Nginx and make sure a file does not exist. For comparison, here's sort of the same thing in JSON. YAML is sort of the Python to JSON's C or Java. It's the same thing, but there's a lot less parentheses. And so this is actually, 2 dictionaries, and there's a key and a value that is a string. It's pretty good at lists. It's good at data. This is a dictionary. It knows about types, so port will actually be interpreted as an integer. It can do booleans. Things are great for YAML, for listing and describing things. This is Python. Probably most of you are familiar with Python. There are some things about Python that are nice that you may have forgotten recently if you haven't been exposed to a Python evangelist. But if you squint at this, you can actually kind of tell what it does without even really reading it. There's the visual layout of it tells you the relationship between the 2 method calls. And you can take that for granted after a while. This is the same sort of thing in YAML, and it's a bit longer, and there's no visual relationship. And for something like this, where you're like, well, we need to only do this if the other thing is true, it doesn't really matter. But sometimes you need to do something more complicated than just this. And then extending Ansible or writing more Ansible logic in YAML becomes awkward, becomes less fun. It's hard to read, it's hard to reason about. nested clauses become progressively uglier. You don't get all of the nice tooling that you get with Python for doing very small local tests for like string parsing or whatever. You have to explicitly register variables, which is a little bit of noise that you could do in one line in Python. And I mean, this doesn't really matter, but it also does matter. It's a little inefficient to do this in YAML. Ansible is very fast, so don't worry about it. But on the other hand, it's still, you have to send things across the network, do some stuff, ship data back, and then you can make a decision about the second clause of your if statement. So, you know, that's the thing. And sometimes you do like a standard task for your deployments, and you're going to do it everywhere. And then you include this in all of your various roles, which are included by other things, and then you run it 200 times. And then what was like a little inefficient becomes a lot inefficient, and then you become sad. So there's a really excellent, well-documented fix for this. You can write your own modules, just like the apt module, just like the file module. You write them in Python. It's super well documented. There's a bunch of helper APIs to make all the little bits work out. You should totally do that. If you find yourself writing like 3 or 4 things in YAML that all involve the same like when condition, you should seriously consider writing a module. And there's a bunch of helper libraries for it, and it's great. You should totally do that. I'm not going to talk at all about writing modules, because it's well documented and it's great, and you should do it. You can't do everything with modules. For instance, they run on the target. And sometimes you write a module that can't ever or should never run on the target because you've got a requirement that your API lives away from the other hosts, from the production hosts or whatever. And you could do something where you always, whenever you used your custom module, you always annotated it with local action, and then that would work. The fetch module in Ansible is not really a module. It's a special thing. So you don't have to do this. You don't have to write local action true every time. And what it does is it downloads a thing from the target host and it brings it to your control machine. So if you're going to do it every time, it's not so great. Modules also can't run on the host and the remote at the same time. So you can't just have a single piece of API that does all the things you want. It doesn't really matter. You can do it on the control machine and then send some things to the remote hosts and then run another module. But if this involves an awful lot of steps and a lot of logic, sometimes it gets slow, it gets ugly. And so why does that matter? Because if you write a little piece of API that's slow and it requires like 3 or 4 extra decorators on it that you have to remember or else it doesn't work, then nobody's going to love it. Nobody's going to use it. If you've ever used an API for the first time and it's a method call and there's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 arguments, and you go through the documentation, and at the end you realize none of the arguments are anything that you care about or want or ever want to change, and they should all be defaults, you're always very sad inside. This is like the mark of an API that you hate and makes your life miserable. So I think it's really important that if you're going to be writing extra tooling, if you're going to be extending Ansible, then you should write nice APIs for Ansible, APIs that look like Ansible. And maybe we do that here more than everybody else. We have a bunch of different deployments. We've got Sprint and T-Mobile and AT&T and Verizon and Telefonica. And there's actually some things that are split out into different products that are separate, and they all have different requirements. And depending on how we're getting along with everybody, we're doing more or fewer releases for various partners. So there's a lot more DevOps. We don't have a production. We have productions. So like the tooling is maybe more important here than at other places, because it has to get reused by other teams, by other people who don't necessarily do DevOps as their sole occupation all the time. So I have this concern, and maybe everybody else doesn't, but you know, if you want to make something real nice, you ought to do this. And the worst thing is, if you have a bad API, somebody is going to look at it, and they're just not going to do it. They're going to do something easier and simpler. And it's might even be wrong. I mean, maybe it was a better way to do it in the first place. But there's a lot of stuff with deployment where there's little bits that are really fiddly and not obvious, and you have to explain them to people with diagrams and like flowcharts. And sometimes you actually did that even with your bad API, and it would really be bad if somebody didn't use it because it was too annoying to use. So making an API that's nice the first time is like the thing you want. So we've talked about sort of the basics of Ansible and how you should totally use modules to extend Ansible, and how modules for extending Ansible are not the end and the be-all of extending Ansible. So what next? Action plugins. You should totally use action plugins. I mean, maybe not for absolutely everything, it would be silly, but they're great for doing kind of fancy things and for doing like kind of advanced things. Don't do these things at the bottom. I put them there, but you shouldn't do them. And action plugins are pretty great. Template is the example that you probably use the most. It's central to any sort of deployment thing, right? You know, you have some variables, they're different on a host, group, environment basis. From a template, you ship it. Template is split up into sort of an action plugin component and a not action plugin component. And the action plugin component renders the template. And then it figures out if it needs to do anything, it copies the template, and it asks the copy module to do the actual copying into place, because we ought to reuse that code, because copying is actually kind of fiddly and there are things you can get wrong, and as long as you've done it right once, you ought to reuse it. This is what it looks like internally. If you check out the Ansible source code, there's been a lot deleted. There are details. But this is basically it. It does some Ginger 2 stuff. It runs the copy module. Maybe it returns a diff. It's the whole thing. So there's no documentation on action plugins online. There was a thing on the Ansible Devel mailing list this week. Somebody said, I want to do some stuff with my module. How do I do it? And the answer is, you should write an action plugin, and you should read the existing action plugins. But so here is my very first step at thinking about documentation for action plugins. It's a Hello World thing. It doesn't run any modules. It never talks to remote hosts. This is a class. It gets loaded into the main loop, hence my warnings about doing awful monkey badging things. And it has a standard name. If you call it an action module, it gets it's an action plugin. And I know that it's an action module and not an action plugin, but you all work with computers. You all know about this kind of naming and consistency. It's just part of life. So yeah, if you take this and you also make sure that there's a module in your module path called hello, then you can run it. That module in your module path called hello is actually kind of important. The sort of the namespace for modules is defined by your module path, and then if there's an action plugin with the same name, it gets run instead. And you can also, you know, after you're done doing your action plugin-y things, just sort of finish it all up with the module, which is easier to write and easier to maintain and debug, and doesn't involve internals so much. Template does this, copy does this. Copy is actually an action plugin plus a module with the same name. You can also reuse action plugins from other action plugins. This is how you would do this. The import action module as sync is really important. If you don't do that, you will have lots of namespace fun, because the way it works is it takes the file, it pulls the action module object out of it. There's a little bit of boilerplate. You'll probably recognize some of this signature from the hello world if you were paying like really close attention. But the first thing, the con, is the connection. That's SSH, Paramigo, your local host thing. You can fill around with where temporary files are stored. The module name has to be specified. I've never tried it with a different module name than the module name that it came with. I don't know what happens if you change that. This is not, by the way, probably not the best example of a great API. But on the other hand, it's sort of an undocumented internal thing. So we'll take what we can get. The args you may recognize as being standard Ansible style key value args, just as a string. And then there's also inject, which is definitely going to be unfamiliar, but it's something you're probably familiar with if you've toyed with Ansible at all. Inject is the local context for that host. It's all the variables overridden by their environment, their group, the host variables, the facts that are available, plus the default things about what host you're connecting to, all that sort of thing. If you are doing action plugin development, you're probably going to be wanting to debug something pretty quickly. And then you will get to use this, which is my absolute favorite API signature. Can anybody guess what this does?
Verbosity?
Yeah. And each of these is just a function. You give it a string. Depending on how many V's you have, that's the verbosity level it corresponds to. It's great. And this is the even better thing about this. You can extend it to support as many V's as you would like. So if you want to have things that are so secret they can only be seen if you add 10 V's to your command line, this is totally a thing you can do. And in fact, I recommend it. Another thing that you can really only do if you're deep into the secret world of action plugins is supporting diff mode. And this, in fact, was the question that was asked the other day. And I added the slide after reading it, and I didn't answer the mailing list thing, which I'm terrible for, and I should do. But yeah, it's actually really easy to add diff mode support for your module. You just add a diff thing to your return data object. And it doesn't matter what the keys are called. They can be anything. It just goes through a pair at a time and spits out a diff. You can also pre-render it and just give it a string. But if you don't want to depend on the system having diff installed, this is pretty great. You can also do terrifying connection magic with action plugins. If you're really going to write something super complicated and super involved. This is actually sort of usually the reason why you want to do this. If you're doing your development on a host that you cannot SSH to, or your control machine can't SSH to itself, and you have something where you're fiddling around with the target in the action plugin, you don't want it to break because it tried to SSH to itself and wasn't set up right. It would be terrible. So you can actually, in the action plugin, make sure that you're not going to try and SSH to localhost, because why bother? You can also do stuff to SSH. There's this thing that makes Ansible very fast compared to other SSH-based deployment tools. They use control persist, which probably everybody should be using, but they don't. And what control persist does is it just doesn't it persists connections, SSH connections, for some amount of time. And if you need to connect to the machine again to do something else, you just reuse the old one. You don't have to renegotiate. This turns out to be great. It turns out to be really expensive to reopen a new SSH connection. But SSH itself is not very expensive. And it's really fast. And so one of the things that Ansible supports is letting you fiddle with the SSH arguments, both for compatibility reasons and also so you can make the control persist timeout longer. Because sometimes you want to deploy a lot of machines and maybe you aren't going to come back to the other ones for a long time. And anyway, you can use that to write a horrible, super duper bulletproof IP tables applicator where you can guarantee, or try really hard to guarantee, that even if you write yourself a set of IP tables rules that will lock yourself out of the box, it will sort of detect that you have done that. And then the apply confirm thing will come in with a brand new connection, not using control persist to validate all this. And this is something that I did to port from our previous project, which had a similar sort of thing. And I worked really hard on it, and I really liked the code. It was the most fun I had writing C and Python in a long time. And you totally shouldn't do this, and I'm not putting the code in the GitHub project where the rest of the slides and the examples are, because you shouldn't do it. You should, write a set of conventions for setting up your firewall rules. You just can't get into this trouble in the first place. You'll be happier. And then you don't have to suddenly pause to do this, full reconnect occasionally. But it's something you totally can do if you're really interested in fiddling around with the internals. And this is actually how you do it. You change the SSH args in the constructor of your action module, and then in the destructor you set it back to the old one. There are details, but that's sort of the whole of it. This is where you can go to see the full examples and play with them. The slides are also there in the GH pages branch. This is actually coming out of GitHub. Do people have questions? Because I would really like to answer some questions.
Do you have any strategies for testing the actual action modules or action plates?
It's a good question. It's kind of hard. You can do doc tests. You can do integration tests. I haven't had a lot of good luck with unit testing them. I haven't gotten the full plumbing all set up for whatever reason. But it's a little easier with modules, and it's more possible than with YAML. So.
A question about the diff example.
Yes.
So does it go into the action plugin runs locally, right?
Yes.
So you pull the file, the remote file compared to the one that you're proposing, based on the template, and then you print the diff. And
Yeah.
Then, so it does the pulling and then.
Well, you have to do the pulling.
Hmm.
So if you're going to write your own action module with your own diff mode.
So this is architectural question, I guess. One of the things you said you're often dealing with is deploying in very different environments. You have multiple production environments. And then you spoke about good APIs and then writing super duper bulletproof things.
Right.
So is a lot of this geared towards bulletproofing deployment of the same code on different production environments and taking the environmental differences sort of abstracted out and in the library?
So this is sort of for building primitives that other people can use for setting things up.
So I guess my question is, logical, where does specificity of the environment goes in?
Well, have you used Ansible much? Or
Not that much firsthand.
okay, they've got sort of they've got a native notion of an environment for setting up differences between environments and lists of hosts. I don't know if that answers your question. The
I was
reason,
looking more specifically, you were giving some examples of how to write highly reusable building blocks. And I was looking for where the magic happens of essentially hooking to the environmental differences and environmental parameters.
well, so, I mean, these are
Because the end
reusable.
of, do I understand right, that the portability across environments, so that you deploy the same way with a higher level of routines, if you will,
Right.
is working robustly
Right, so.
across different environments.
So this is sort of at a lower level even than that. This is for just building your roles and your plays to do things. So if for like even this IP tables thing, we have like a standard IP tables thing that everybody uses in their different environments, and they supply it with a set of variables that are not here mostly for briefness. And so, like, a lot of the users of this don't even see the apply or the apply confirm. They just know that they've got an IP tables role that they apply to all of their hosts, that they give some variables to. And so that role sort of takes care of dealing with the environment differences. But you can also use this if you're doing, like, if you're using scripts to set up your IP tables instead of a static file. So it's more of a primitive below environment.
Okay.
service.
Thanks.
To kind of speak to that, couldn't you use the inject variables to actually write a primitive that would act on the environment, or the node state, which would hopefully also encompass the environment state?
It's true, we build a template and then load the template, which is sort of a more Ansible native way of dealing with the environment. Yeah.
So, going back to your Hello World example, so you have code that shows the action plugin itself. Did you show YAML that actually used it?
I didn't, but it wouldn't be very complicated. You would have a list for your task list, and you would have a dictionary in it that would be called hello. Well, it would have a key that was hello, and then any value that came after that key would simply be ignored, because it doesn't do anything with its arguments. So,
Hello, colon.
yes.
It's a module.
Yeah, the action plugins, they look exactly like modules. Fetch is an action plugin. It looks just like any other module. It's sort of invisible that it's how it's implemented.
Can you use third-party Python libraries in action modules?
Yes, if it's in your current working virtual environment, then you can use it in your action plugin. And that's certainly easier to deal with than modules, where you're really supposed to never depend on third-party libraries or anything out there, simply because the setup is not real well. It's not particularly supported. You have to do that out of band, basically, which is terrible.
Can you orchestrate multiple different module calls in action plugins?
Yes, you can call as many sub-modules as you would like. I don't think I've seen any that use more than like 2, but. All right, well, I think I'm done. There's, I think Stephen, can I keep going, or? And announce the pizza and beer upstairs, or is it recorded? Also that, if you want to come and do good work, we could use you. You pay real well.
Yeah, I can talk about it. And then I'm going to take
All
over.
right.
Thank you, Henry. we're going to try and set these things up on a regular basis, trying to host more here. We have the next one penciled in, or inked in, I suppose, for October 29th. It's 2 months from now. Live D and actually hardened it and proved that it can work for us at our scale. And that's pretty much it. We hope you had a good time. We're going to kind of escort everybody up to the 6th floor where we've got beer and soda and water and pizza. And we can hang out and have a good time and talk. And if you guys had other questions you wanted to ask Henry, he'll be around and talk to you one-on-one as well, and the rest of us. So, thanks.
Yeah.